Welcome to Diabetic, the podcast where a T1D artist and a T1D expert come together to bake some bread, and then we break bread with smart and interesting people as we talk through the human in health and technology. I'm Stephen Horrocks, PhD and expert in experiences with diabetes and devices.
And I'm Melissa Horrocks, type 1 diabetic, artist, baker, creator of all things.
And in this episode, we have cinnamon rolls and diabetic stereotypes and performance with Dr. Bianca C. Frazer.
Yay!
This should be a really good conversation, and we are especially excited to talk about these cinnamon rolls.
They are amazing.
My word. All right, so first off, we are talking about these cinnamon rolls. Now, we've made these cinnamon rolls a number of times, and this recipe actually comes from Bread Illustrated once again.
One of our favorites.
Yeah, seriously. The black pepper cheddar loaf that we had talked about in an earlier episode also came from this cookbook. This recipe for cinnamon rolls, though, I think it's probably the best cinnamon roll recipe that I've ever made.
The first time you made it, it was like shocking.
Seriously.
It was shocking how good it was.
Oh my word. Just so rich. Like every bit, every part of the recipe, everything is, it just
works. Its proportions are great. You use brown sugar in there, right?
Yes.
So I think that made a big difference in the kind of texture.
In the filling inside.
Of the filling.
Yeah. And, it's funny because I feel like the proportions of that filling play a major role in how a lot of this plays out, because there is actually like a ton of brown sugar in this recipe.
Yeah,
in that filling. There's
not
a
for
lot.
the faint of heart.
And part of why that's so useful and important, though, is that as it bakes, all of that melts and becomes liquid. And so some of that then flows downward and gets this really intense kind of caramelized flavor on the bottom of these cinnamon rolls as it then is flavoring throughout in the swirls.
Just thinking about it.
Oh, my word. And so the filling is just, it's so like decadent and intense.
Mm-hmm.
The main part of the bread that I think is really challenging and can be, especially if you don't have a stand mixer, breads like this take a lot of time.
Yeah, a lot of kneading.
Get a lot of really tricky.
It's exhausting.
Because this is a very enriched dough, right? We're talking...
What does enriched mean?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
Just shooting.
That's right. Lob it up so I can knock it out of the park. So a basic, quote-unquote, straight dough for bread making would include flour, water, salt, and yeast. Right? That's the basis of most breads. For enriched doughs, that process, that recipe is, quote-unquote, enriched with a number of either dairy products or other enriching agents that will change the structure of the dough. So one enriching agent is milk, so milk instead of water, which this has. Eggs are an important enriching agent as well, which this has 3 of. So there's
I was
actually
going
a
to
lot.
say, does this have all the enriching agents?
It absolutely does. Another is sugar. And so there is sugar in the dough, not so much for the inclusion of sweetness to the actual bread, but because of how it kind of adds to the softness of the final product. But lastly, and most importantly, and most tricky, is the butter, because there is a stick and a half of butter in this.
I remember
dough.
the first time watching you mix this was really weird.
How so?
Is this the one where you because you're throwing pieces of butter as it's mixing, and it kind of changes the structure of the dough. You kind of watch the structure change.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. I mean, butter, obviously, the structure of it changes as you use it, and the temperature, and I don't know. It just was really something I don't think I'd ever witnessed visually myself.
Yeah. And that change of the dough structure, frankly, that's one of the things I like most about bread making, because you can do it in like each of these different breads. You can see and feel how the dough changes over time, and it's really cool. But yeah, so what you throw this in 1 tablespoon at a time at room temperature butter, 1 tablespoon at a time, and slowly that gets kneaded and incorporated in, and then you throw in another tablespoon. And so you got to do that 12 times with this recipe because there's a ton of butter. But here's the rub.
The rub?
When I was mixing this and starting the process of like whisking together the dry ingredients, I realized I had not pulled out any butter to get to room temperature.
Oops.
Yeah. Cold butter, not so good for this process. It'll technically work, but it'll take you about 3 times as long because you've got to warm up the butter as you are kneading it into the dough, and it takes forever to get it incorporated. And so we come to our important bread tip here. If you are last minute making a decision to include butter in a dough and you didn't pull any out, this is a great little tip from America's Test Kitchen. Not from this book, but from a different context. If you cut this butter into small cubes, we're talking like take that tablespoon chunk and cut it into fourths. So you've got these small little cubes. And take a tiny little handful of the flour from the recipe and toss those cubes in that flour so that they're like a little bit coated. Just put them like in a bowl, on a plate, whatever. And seriously, 5 or 10 minutes, they're at room temperature.
Yeah, it's
shocking.
Wild.
It is
it's a
so
really
wild.
Cool trick.
And it's super helpful. And then that flour just gets incorporated right back in to the recipe, so you're not messing with your kind of balance. Mm-hmm. So anyway, handy little bread tip. We will have some kind of photos and discussion of this recipe on the Instagram. And so go and check some of that out because this recipe is absolutely delicious.
Yeah, make it for Easter weekend. It's the perfect time.
Oh, that's it. That's the one. All right, our guest today is Dr. Bianca C. Frazer. She is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She is a teacher, speaker, writer, editor, and does a lot of work in studies of performance, aesthetics, representations, especially of non-apparently disabled people, things that aren't as outwardly identifiable, like diabetics. She's also co-editor of the recently published Undoing Diabetes, Representation, Disability, Culture with Dr. Heather R. Walker. And we are very excited and pleased to have you as a guest on the show. So, Bianca, welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm so honored and excited to be here.
Likewise. We usually like to begin by asking guests this 2-pronged question. What is your relationship with bread, and what is your relationship with diabetes?
I love those questions. Those are such good openers.
I think so too.
Right. I mean, so I can say I love bread. I think bread's so delicious, so fun. Maybe like banana bread makes me think of my family, my mom. And then with any discussion of food, there's always that little asterisk of, and it's a complicated relationship to bread and which I guess goes right into that second question of relationship to diabetes. I have diabetes. I have type 1 diabetes. I've had diabetes since I was 23 months old. So my whole kind of conscious experience has been having diabetes as this companion, this part of my life. So I didn't have that moment where, I got diagnosed and then had that identity shift, but so diabetes has just always been a part of my life.
Yeah. So 2 follow-up questions there. First off, you mentioned that banana bread is one of those things that kind of triggers family stuff.
Yeah.
Right? What is it about banana bread, or are there particular memories or connections there?
Oh my gosh. I think it just frankly takes me right back to my mom and growing up and sort of this like a beloved recipe and some of the notes like use, some like bananas that are starting to brown, but maybe put a little banana extract in so you get that flavor and walnuts and chocolate chips. And
Mm.
it's not even banana bread in our house without walnuts in there. Like all, cookies, everything. It's like have some walnuts in the mix.
Yes. That's so funny because most of my family growing up, and then especially now, very much anti-nuts in things. So it's really, it's wild how some of these, I mean, because banana bread for many, it's like, well, it's banana bread. Everybody knows banana bread, right? But there are some really pretty specific things about our banana bread, right?
Absolutely. That is, yeah, I can picture the recipe in my mind, like the
Yes.
handwritten note card in my mom's like lovely handwriting. And yeah, in our family, it's walnuts or it's going to someone else's table plate house.
Yeah. So do you have a copy of that note card with the recipe card?
I have a photocopy. I don't have the actual sacred
real,
note card in my possession. That's still in that sacred, it's like a binder that has these recipes on note cards that are like intergenerational, like some that are even older than my mom. And I can picture the binder that has the note cards kind of slated in the little plastic sheets. And that's like all
Wow.
these good recipes in there.
So it's like sheet protector style in the
Yeah.
binder. That's so great. So that's so funny you mentioned that because I have such vivid memories of my mom's recipe binder. And it's the same kind of thing, like this big 3-inch or more, I don't even know, huge, big gray 3-ring binder. But hers was all glued in. And so it was like adhesive. It's still there. And I'm going to have to go and make some photocopies, I think. But
so precious, so many secrets, the tips and the tricks that are written in, and recipes from other families, but in our version, the notes in the margins, like add a little bit more of this, or you really got to pull it out of the oven at this time. And
yes, the marginalia. I'm a sucker for the marginalia. This
that's
and otherwise. Yeah, I'm just I'm an archive freak, so that's kind of where my brain goes. But so you mentioned too that you were diagnosed as a infant/toddler. I guess it would be toddler, closer to 2, right?
Yeah.
And so diabetes has always been part of everything. And so I guess one question I have there, right? I've had a number of conversations with people who are diagnosed very young, but then also some who are diagnosed, 2 years ago and they're in their 40s or 50s, sometimes even a little bit older than that.
Totally.
And so I can't imagine that at that age you'd have any personal memory of diagnosis, but I am curious how diagnosis has been kind of remembered by the family, or how that's like talked about.
No, I mean, I think that's such a cool question. And it's sort of, as diabetes is like the thing that's always there and shaping my experience, but then the sort of moments where new parts of it were introduced to me that I wasn't aware of as a kid. So I think sort of some of my youngest memories of like birthday parties, you don't get to eat the cake, or
right.
Halloween, like be a part of the event, but maybe you'll get some sugar-free candy. And this was in the 90s too, where the technology and management looked really different.
Mm-hmm.
I have a really distinct memory in high school where, man, I was struggling so much with managing diabetes and not letting anyone know like that I had to do that, and starting to have a conversation about complications and like that first moment of like, oh, what? Like, I don't just have to like live with this. There's these effects. Like now we're going to be talking about complications. And so I have like kind of specific memories of learning new layers of what living with diabetes meant. And then now the disability identity journey, that's like really been so liberating and fun and exciting. So yeah, I do feel like there's different moments that are maybe not like diagnosis related, but like
Right.
new eras in the life of diabetes.
Interesting. So there are these markers, right? Pinpoints or kind of flags stuck
Hmm.
in along the way that mark that as you go through. And that's really interesting, right? Because there's a lot of conversation about diagnosis.
Yeah.
But, and some of this comes from the disability study side of things as well. Part of the problem is that that always implies that there was a before and that there was
Hmm.
an after, or there will
Hmm.
be,
Hmm.
or maybe that there has to be, right? Which is even more messy territory. But that's not the case for everybody, that there actually isn't really a conception of the before. This is just what existence is. This is life, right?
Absolutely. And all the different like pieces of ourselves and our stories that we carry with us and that evolve over time. And yeah, it's just so funny to have
Yeah.
diabetes as this shaping, ever present piece of my life. But I mean, there's so many parts of our identities that are also that sort of shaping element
Yeah.
of our experience. So, yeah, I think the sort of before and after can be, yeah, like a misdirect in what the human experience is.
Yeah, and like it also like doesn't actually give people space to live and exist sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
like I said, it gets into really messy territory, opening up the nuances of some of what that actually means, right?
totally. And it's hard to avoid. Like, I feel like that is, I
Mm,
mean, I'm drawn there too. Like, wait, what is your story? When did this start? And what time in your life? And how is that transit? Like, what is that? I don't know. And just wanting to know people's stories, there's an interest in the start or how did this happen in your life? And so then that's like that center of gravity where you go, like, what was your diagnosis
yeah.
story and what did it look like?
Yeah, I mean, we have to start a story somewhere, right? And so the impetus to kind of do that, I get it. I also get how it kind of misses the mark sometimes. So,
Yeah.
um, and this conversation about storytelling, I think, uh, connects well with a lot of your work in performance and performativity. Because I know that you have a background in theater and dance, and really, in many ways, there's a lot implied about kind of experience, embodiment on stage with people, and how that influences kind of information. And so, how how does your expertise in that medium of performance, especially stage performance, but otherwise too, inform some of the ways that you are thinking about disability, chronic illness, maybe diabetes, and or vice versa?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of my story a little bit, I've been thinking about it as like these two tracks where I was always, diabetic, managing or suffering, poorly managing, like it's just
Sure.
experiencing all of this kind of agony around diabetes. And I was interested in the arts and humanities and storytelling and,
Mm-hmm.
that juicy center of what makes us human and storytelling. So around the time that I started to go to grad school, I was interested in theater, studying Shakespeare. I was not thinking about bringing these worlds together. That was nowhere on my
Yeah.
mind. And then it was through some coursework where I learned about theater artists and solo performance folks who were creating work about living with diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And one artist, Robbie McCauley, she's a Black woman and she recently passed away. But
Oh,
her work talking about racism and systems that were affecting what her experience with diabetes was. And she's this really beloved, highly respected theater artist, and how difficult it was for her to talk about diabetes while being this theater artist, and how much kind of shame and stigma she felt about
mm,
bringing that up with folks who are interested, who want to know people's stories, who want to, give space to what is happening in your body and what's your story. So I think that's kind of your question about embodiment and chronic illness and performance. Once I started realizing that these two things could be in conversation and that folks were already doing that work, I feel like that's like the itch I wanted to scratch was like, how can we tell stories about this experience, like the lived experience of diabetes? And there's all these tropes. There's these ways that we have seen diabetes, and what we see on stage and in performance. I mean, it's what we see in sitcoms. It's what we see in movies. Like it really kind of tracks across the larger American cultural imagination about
For
diabetes.
Sure. Yeah.
So so then disability studies became this really urgent tool to talk about like some of the activism that was happening and like creating art about the cost of insulin and what it's like to live in a diabetic body, that isn't just I'm a human plus diabetes. Like there's something happening in my embodiment that I want to share with you. And so some of those artists, Robbie McCauley, Diana Wyan has this amazing piece where I was so struck how she used sound design and lighting design to like make me feel what it feels like to have a low blood sugar as an audience member. Like these loud sounds and what she's doing with light, it made me feel that as an audience member in ways that have been hard to find on stage. Like how do you show like what it feels like to be low, or what the daily life. I mean, and there's a tension too with like, do we just show authenticity? Do we show testing your blood sugar on stage? Or like, what is kind of the juicy center that we want to get to and sharing with each other, with an audience and being in community,
right?
Sharing the experience of living with diabetes.
Yeah. That kind of, that language you're getting at with this shared experience of diabetes. I think it's one of the things that I have always found particularly engaging and powerful about performance. And I think this tracks in a number of ways. Obviously, that's at the core of why stories in general have the power they do. It's about connecting with another person's experience and humanity. But there's something about the physical proximity of another person in telling that story that I think is unique there. And you mentioned some of these tropes and things that representation is often built around. I say often, usually, right? Almost
most
always.
Frequently, typically, commonly. Hard to find exceptions, certainly.
Right. And so, like you said, and you were referencing this artist, Robbie McCauley, right? But the part of what it sounds like and tracks in a number of other spaces that diabetics and disabled people, chronically ill people, aren't expected to exist on the stage, right? That's not a space where they're usually, quote unquote, allowed to be, right?
Absolutely. Like the dominant kind of trope, I mean, like cutting across any form of disability, as a narrative device, disability is often used to do something for someone else, for a non-disabled character, to learn about themselves, to grow, to, get some sort of life lesson, or, like a moral barometer, like, wow, Scrooge was really selfish and uncaring. And now we learn how much he's grown. And so that's something you can find characters with all forms of disabilities, like really frequently. But what they're doing in the story is like usually all the same, helping someone else learn and grow. And so to actually kind of center the person with the chronic illness, with the disability, and to investigate what's their experience, I find that to be incredibly rare. And I mean, we're seeing certainly more happening right now, but hard. And so it's really interesting to track that with diabetes too. Like how often when we do have representations of diabetes, is that used more often to like say something about the friend group that person's in, or the family, or the
overall social situation, right? I'm thinking of the, post-apocalyptic representation of diabetics means no insulin, and so it's constant crisis. Everyone's going to die, right? And that
Yep.
like constant state of ever present, almost tragedy seems like
Yeah.
that's the other trope, right? It's like you're there to help show the story and growth of others, and also is tragic, and that's like the whole story.
Absolutely. To raise the stakes. Why is this situation urgent? Oh, because there's a diabetic and they are having a crisis. So the situation for us is urgent because of, I mean, that's the plot device route of this person's diabetic crisis is going to elevate the stakes for all of us in the story. And yeah, you can track that across so many movies, so many TV shows.
Yeah. Totally. And that's I like to refer to that as the Steel Magnolias effect, right? And that's because it's like every time it shows up, it's that or it's shame-based and it's stigmatized. And that's like the two representations. And so it's like, here we go again on, The Resident or whatever this medical drama is, And so some of this comes back to then this conversation about what it means to perform diabetes. And I think this probably applies both on stage and in general, because there are scripts, right? There are scripts for everybody, even existing just in society, about how people are supposed to perform it and how they're not, right? And I'm curious if you have either written into and or done work otherwise in kind of unpacking that performance off stage as well.
Oh, I love that question. And that's another sort of like research itch that I'm excited and want to scratch. Like those nuggets that you're like, there's something there. And what is going on? The way that, everyday life with diabetes is a form of performance. And how often, I mean, thanks to technology often, or just what I'm sensing in my own body, like I know that I'm having a low right now, but I'm in a job interview. And so I'm not going to perform. I'm going to do everything I can to perform that I'm not having a crisis, as I'm internally aware that something really bad is happening. Or I'm on a walk with a friend and I am going low, but I need them to know that I'm going low. So I'll it's always a little gray area, like, how out of it am I and what's going on? Because I need you to understand that I'm having a crisis, even if it seems like I'm doing fine. So I'm super interested in that, like ways that we choose to hide diabetes in daily life or show, and how we're always negotiating that. It's never the sort of like, we get to turn it off or put it away. Like we're always making those choices.
Yeah. And that whole kind of conversation that you're pointing toward when you're with somebody else in a moment of crisis or other very specific need right now, either you continue that performance of quote unquote normal, and that's where this gets really dangerous, right? Continue the performance of normal, or let on and then open yourself up to what can be some very real social consequences, right? So it's like the medical consequences or the social consequences. What is it that I'm leveraging here, right?
Totally. I mean, I already mentioned it, but I just recently had the experience of being in a job interview, and it's like 10 minutes before the call, I'm nervous and flustered, and suddenly realizing like, oh, it's because I'm going low, but this person is calling me for a job interview. And do I say like, can we push this? Do I say my answers might be a little scattered in the but also like, but hire me. But I'm also like trying to, it was a messy moment of what am I going to show this person? How am I going to try to perform that I'm a capable, intelligent person you want to work with? And
but also this moment is not, I'm not necessarily just focused on this conversation.
Right. Like I have something going on right now that, I think that gets that daily performance, because I mean, that's like a moment, but we folks with diabetes, like we're making choices like that all the time. And I don't think other people like fully understand that, they know that. And so that's again where I think like theatrical performance can be a really cool space, because you can start to make those choices in what you show, what you disrupt. Marina Tsesplina is another artist who I love and have learned so much from. And in one performance piece, she's kind of inviting the audience into the beginning of her performance, and she's sitting on the apron of the stage and testing her blood sugar, and in direct address with the audience. And she says, like, I have to test my blood sugar for my mental health to know if I'm okay. But for you as the audience, like, has the performance already started? Like, has the show already begun? Because she's sitting center stage doing that, and the audience is watching her, and it's all kind of a part of that moment in a performance that's about diabetes. And so the stage is an interesting place with lots of kind of paradoxes, what we see, what we don't see, but we get to make choices and we get to experiment.
Right. And that, even something as small as, like, you're talking about the move of sitting on the skirt, because there's a lot implied about that as a threshold, right? That's in between. And so it's just building on what is that whole idea of, have we started or not? Am I on stage or am I off stage? Is this theatrical performance or just social performance? How are we negotiating that together now? That's fascinating.
Right. And what do you do in that moment? Suddenly you find out that you have a high blood sugar or you're low, like the sort of the stakes and the urgency of being in that with the audience, I think, is interesting. And there's so many like choices. I have another friend who's a professional actor, and he talks about having a stage manager hold his CGM and kind of know his pictures are off stage while he goes on and like plays Richard III. And I never knew what to make of that. Like, that's so intimate, giving your devices to someone else to see what your blood sugars are, but then to like support you and give you, like some juice if you need that off stage. And like, what a wild dynamic that's both hiding, but bringing in community and relationship into the performance space. I never thought that was like an interesting choice.
Big time, right? I've talked with a lot of folks who have family members who are connected to their Dexcom or whatever. Yeah. And even some of those they talk through as like a real stretch, right? A previous guest on the show, Josh Iddings, was talking about his child, who's now a teenager, is connected on their cell phone so that they will like text from school and be like, hey, I just saw this alert. Like, are you good? Are you getting something? And, it's like, but at the same time, I have talked with others who are like, hey, this information, this personal health info, I'm not going to share that with a soul. Why do they need to know this about me? Right?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Oh, I get it. And especially like the complicated place of being a parent who's, presumably not diabetic, and like all of the fear and concern, and that like having access to that information is so like, it sets your mind at ease.
Right.
To know, but like, my gosh, that information feels so private and so empowering in some ways to keep, to even have that power. Like, what am I going to show you? What am I not going to show you? That I don't always have to tell someone if I'm having a low. Like, I can handle that privately. So that is, I'm not brave enough to have anyone I know and love see my budget. Even at the doctor, it's a little,
No, I hear that, and I am, I'm a partner of someone with type 1. And so that's my relationship with things, is when alarms go off or when moments of need or crisis are happening, or if the pump is just frustrated and needs a battery or whatever, and it's just freaking out too. That's when I am like called by the device or diabetes to interact there. But I don't have it on my phone. I can't technically because it's a different device, but it's a balance, because we're talking about representations of your body in some way, right? And so like, how do you how do you negotiate how you are providing access to your body, right? That's a big question.
Yeah, what is seen, what is known, where you have power. I mean, my husband is so observant and so wonderful. And so I didn't even realize that when I tested my blood sugar, the little meter made a different type of beeping noise if I was
Yeah.
high, if I was low.
Yes.
And he picked up on that before I had never noticed that. But he would be like, "Oh, you must be high right now. Like I heard that little beep beep beep." And
How
I'm
many
like,
beeps? Yep.
yeah, like okay, okay. But yeah, I really, it seems like to be a conversation about intimacy, and
Yeah.
what those numbers are is really kind of intimate. And so it's just exciting, like all the places where you can make choices, what you share, what you don't share, and still try to like be empowered in that dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah, and that finding and negotiating empowerment, I think, is that operative piece, right? Because I also have engaged with some who feel like they have experienced real encroachment from other people in wanting to constantly know and wanting to constantly be doing or interjecting into treatment and all that kind of stuff when they really don't want or need that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that negotiation back and forth can be really tricky.
I can't even imagine. And the sort of the technology, which I know is a piece like you're very interested in, and some things like the development of the CGM, that was when I was in college. So I was a little bit more, had a little bit more agency, was kind of entering into adulthood at that point. But I can't even imagine thinking about what I would have experienced in high school and playing sports or doing theater, and like how much other people might have wanted to have access to that data, or might have made sense. Like if you're in a play and someone should be watching your blood sugars, but then just that for me would just feel like such, also like have some violation in it, as well as like, I get it as a safety thing, but
yes, I get it, but right, that tension,
totally.
which reminds me of, I don't know if you are familiar with Beta Cell. There's a podcast
Love
and
Beta
foundation.
Cell.
Beta Cell's fantastic. He did an episode on pilots. I don't know if you caught this, but there's a lot of messy business around licensing and type 1 in particular. Yeah. But there have been fairly recent changes in that licensing paradigm. But I have seen recently some type 1 pilots who have been posting things on Instagram, usually featured on a big account, showing how they have to have their CGM monitor in the hands of the other pilot to keep an eye on where they're at. And so it's like, we're talking then about an employer who is mandated to have constant access to your body and your personal health information, which is a whole other set of like, wow, where do we draw these boundaries?
Right. And like, what, it just kind of the thought that rises up in me is like what we expect of disabled people to like to get some sort of validation. Like we don't ask that of other people, and just that expectation to prove, to document, to always for some reason, like hearing that makes me feel really sad, and really like that is inappropriate. Wow. Wild.
And it's there's a lot of there's a lot to work through there, because we're also talking about people's livelihood and what they have built their lives and careers around doing. They have very specific skill sets that they've built over years, and to then with the swish of a pen be told you can't, and then with another swish of the pen basically say, well, you can, but if you jump through these hoops and we can see it, and so that gets into some messy territory. But I wanted to kind of reach back a little bit to one of the pieces of conversation you were mentioning a few minutes ago about comedy, and jokes, and especially how, because comedy has a very, to call it a rocky relationship would be polite, right? With diabetes. And so I'm curious kind of what drew you. You have written recently in your article in the recent book, pulls on some of this as well. What drew you to this conversation and how you're getting at it?
Yes, I'm so glad. What a good reach back. And I was thinking about this conversation and how I feel like it's worth mentioning that we're having this national, I mean, almost international conversation about the power of a joke with this public display between Chris Rock and Will Smith. And, Jada Pinkett Smith, her alopecia at the center of that moment and that interaction.
Right.
And so I have a huge interest in the power and the role of comedy and what happens when like disability, chronic illness, like the body is at the center of that, and like marginalized folks are at the center of that.
Right.
And yeah, kind of the power of comedy and what that provokes. So it's just an interesting moment where we're nationally thinking about that.
Right.
But I can definitely speak to my chapter in the book, which is looking at the television show Parks and Recreation.
Yeah, which it really rings true because I live in Lafayette, Indiana, which is basically Pawnee.
That's amazing. You're living in like the prototype where like the vision of
literally there
show.
is urban legend that Pawnee Eagleton is based off of Lafayette and West Lafayette. So
I love that. Oh my gosh. So you can keep us honest in other pieces of the show got right, or maybe because well, what I can say is that I think working with Heather, so the co-editor of this book, I gained so much from her, just sort of dreaming like what we want to do with this book. We know we want it to be about representation. When I was thinking about what I wanted to write about, I have loved this show, Parks and Recreation, for so many years. For folks who love it, I mean, it's like every line you can quote, every joke, you can play games, like your personality, which two characters are you from the show?
Yes.
And yet, like as a diabetic viewer, I was always so aware in a interesting way where other folks like just do not even have a critical lens on jokes about representations of diabetes. And so just that feeling of like, how is no one talking about what this show is openly saying and doing, mocking its characters with diabetes and kind of putting diabetes as a part of the identity of this town that, using the term fat as like a derogatory term and kind of depicting this Midwestern setting as they're unhealthy, they eat junk food with that, like with no way to hold themselves back. Like,
there's this representation and assumption of the inability to control oneself. And that's at the root of all the problems, right? It's all about that individual choice. And it's so gross.
It's
right?
so
That's
gross.
it's such a gross move.
And I think that what made this show kind of stand out as unique, because it's almost like a sitcom toolkit. Like you're going to make a joke about diabetes, something about diabetes and sugar. There's so many shows that do that. But what was striking to me about Parks and Rec was this sort of government context that it's happening in a local government setting, and what choices, interventions, like how are they going to approach diabetes as a problem in their town? And so as I was kind of looking at the episodes and looking at the techniques, the idea that like, it doesn't even really matter what they do, that they can do these silly things like hold a telethon to raise money for diabetes research or create a new PSA. But all of that is, in the show's view, it's okay to make those things kind of silly and over the top because they're not effective in any way. The only thing that really matters is these individual people in the town who are so out of control that the government's actions are sort of like meaningless and whatever. So it's a good place to have comedy or do things that are over the top because it's sort of the thing that's the show is parodying are the citizens, are the people, and how kind of careless, reckless, disgusting the people are. And that's where I think there is such a missed opportunity with what we could parody are these large systems that we have to interact with.
Yeah.
You know, I hope it came across, but I opened my chapter with talking about what it's like being on the phone with an insurance agent trying to get insulin, and that it's theater of the absurd. It's ridiculous. It's an hour-long phone call that goes nowhere, that, you know, is a maze of people and buttons, and like nothing makes sense in this conversation to get this life-sustaining medication that I've needed for over 30 years. And it is absurd.
And in the end, through all that work,
Yeah.
you're actually probably worse off than you were at the beginning, right?
Right. Like, I didn't get the insulin app that I was on this phone call to get. And in this time, I had just moved to Illinois and was thinking, like, don't we have these cool, like, price insulin copay caps here? Like,
Right.
what is this? Why is this person telling me my insulin is still going to be like hundreds of dollars? Like, what? And Heather was actually the person I was texting, and started to dig a little deeper and find out, like, oh, these kind of flashy stories that get in the news, become headlines, are actually not really like helping the majority of people who are not insured. They're really, and that is a part of the chapter too, are like specific activists who have challenged lawmakers on, like, what you're doing isn't helping, like, isn't really what we need. And lawmakers who have gotten really kind of affronted by that, hearing from diabetic people. And so I feel like Parks and Rec is kind of in that world, and it's a missed opportunity because there's so much comedy in what it's like to live with diabetes is unbelievably hilarious and strange and absurd. And these systems, like how we can use comedy to critique power and who has power. There's a lot to be done there, in like through humor.
Yeah, and I think even in the context of Parks and Rec, right? I think there are some really interesting ways that they have played with comedy as a means of critiquing structures, but it's so limited by this hyper-individualist narrative. And so it's this dominant American culture, bootstraps, individualism kind of framing makes it impossible to frame problems around anything other than individual choice. And so it's like we could punch up, but who's the individual that we can punch up at, because it has to be this one person making a choice. Otherwise, it's not a problem, right?
Totally. We cannot get beyond it and thinking about that, like, hyper individual framework. And so I feel like you're making a great point about, like, looking at things systemically, or in terms of like community or interdependence as like a disability justice value. Like, we all need each other. And when we punch down at diabetics, like, that hurts all of us. And
right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, that does kind of move into that realm of why it is that it is not only a common trope to leverage, that it's such an easy joke that it's lazy, frankly, to do that classic punch down at the diabetics as the framework for your comedy. But it gets into this like question, why is it so acceptable? Right? That's that big question. So yes, it happens a lot, and we can see some of those the stigmas that are in part of that conversation. But, you know, why is it so acceptable for diabetes to be the butt of the joke?
It's a fascinating question. And I've been using this clip in some talks recently where it's, you know, Stephen Colbert from October 2021. So recent, a comedian who's very, like, kind of progressive in his worldview. Right. And in this, on his evening talk show from last fall, he tells a joke where it's like, the Guinness Book of World Record for drinking the most Coke, like, this person has just won this award, but the real winner is diabetes. And it was sort of shocking to me, like, here we are in 2021, someone who you know, would think he, like might have
Socially
has a
conscious
worldview,
guy.
socially conscious guy. And so, I mean, in terms of the why, I think, I mean, it's a research itch, right? Like, why are we so attached to this stigma around diabetes? And even in the community, like thinking of, I mean, I was raised with that, like thinking of type 2s as, oh, those people who do deserve that. And then kind of my journey, like deconstructing that,
right,
the defensive othering. And so I think you're right that it's the individualism kind of framework that is beloved in the United States, and the kind of the stigma around food and what food means and how food is a location of choice, which you're like right in that mix with talking about bread and how we relate to bread. I think that's like a really provocative choice to open the conversation.
Yeah. And, in that vein, it is interesting because anytime I have a person-to-person conversation with someone, when it comes up that I co-host this show, and what's your show? And it's called Diabreadic. Oh, interesting. Yeah, we talk about bread and diabetes, and they're like, wait a minute. Every time there's a wait a minute.
Yeah.
And this comes from people with experience too, right? I'm having conversations with people who either live with or have close personal ties with people who live with diabetes, and every single time it has a moment of it catches. Wait a minute, because it feels like it is antithetical, right? And that framework is so problematic, and that's why I like the productive tension of that. But yeah, and I don't have an answer for that question either of why, right? Why is it the easy butt of the joke that everybody gets to at some point? Every comic, every show, every whatever, you see it happen constantly. And there are a lot of parts to that we could probably talk through, but I think it is that productive space of having that itch, because the more we scratch at it, right, the more it reveals what's behind the joke, right? It's not about the sugar. It's not about the carbs. It's not even about the thing going on in this person's body. This is about social structures and power in some way, right? And that's the unpacking that I think is tricky.
Yes, the moralizing around food choices and just this idea of health conditions that are thought of as like, you caused this yourself. And that, I have gained so much in like realizing how much more complicated it is than that. And how, I agree with what you're saying. Like, there's a lot to unpack, that it's really rich and honestly like liberating to like say, like, where do these ideas come from? And like, why are we still so stuck there?
Yeah. And that liberation is frankly, it's necessary, right? Yeah. This kind of work is important because that stigmatizing, yes, we're talking about chronic illness, but this is deeply tied to things like race. This is deeply tied to conversations about size and body image and
class,
value and class, and what's valued and who is valued and who is not, right?
And who has access. Like, so many of these choices are framed around like what we can even access, what we can afford, where we live, like what healthcare is that we're getting, like what slate of options we have. It's, framed by all of the pieces you mentioned that are systemic, that are entrenched in history and are not the sort of like ahistorical individual choices that where those jokes are stemming from.
Yeah. And that's why I think I find our conversation here about performance, both on stage, but also potential for comedy and other spaces as well, in doing some of that work of highlighting and trying to kind of pull at that tension around those assumptions and things in order to do something productive. So
comedy and parody, like, it has that power. It critiques those with power, and like laughter has this amazing way to like open us up a little bit and shake us up to consider new ideas. And so I think I think humor is a great entry point to critique some of these systems, to point at how absurd they are, and even like kind of show some new potential. Like what are different ways of being in the world? I think humor is really good, like kind of opens us up to get there.
Yeah. And that, in some ways, I think points to the book project that you co-edited here, because disability studies, especially certain wings that are, like crip theory, crip studies related to things like queer theory, that do that productive work of humor and joy and critique and all of these things wrapped up together, I think is really valuable.
Yes, and valuing like what is at the margins, and not necessarily attempting to like just get into the center or be included in the mainstream. It's like,
yes,
what is the radical life and juice that's happening at the margins that isn't just attempting to be at the center? So I love it. Yes.
Because sometimes the life in those margins for diabetics is about juice. You see what I did there? Okay.
always, like, always.
Yes. Well, Bianca, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
All right. So this conversation with Bianca was great. I loved what she had to say and what she shared about performance, kind of in multiple different ways.
Yeah.
Not only the performance art, but like the performance that we do with our own bodies and with our own diabetes.
Just like in the day-to-day, right?
Yeah.
That kind of social
I thought that was really fascinating. That's really what I love about these conversations are, hearing things that people share that you kind of share with, but haven't realized like how you share those experiences, like when she was talking about like social versus medical consequences of performing, with her job interview, performing that you're okay. And that like, okay, so I'm choosing whether I'm paying attention to my diabetes and like performing that and taking care of my low blood sugar, or I'm performing for this job interview that I may not get if I show this side of performance,
Yeah. Because there's so much writing on that short little interaction, right? Even in a long interview process, right? It might be a few hours long in that kind of interview setting, but that still is such a small snippet of time that has huge long-term implications.
Yeah,
right?
And that feeling of when you're low and trying to perform that you're not is panic inducing. And it's really your body is panicking.
Right.
Your body's panicking saying like something's not okay, but you're also panicking because you're in an interview. Like interviews are freaking scary. So, that's so fascinating to me because I have been there and I don't think I've really known how to explain that performance, like putting that word with it. It's a performance because it is. And I often would say like I'm pretending that I'm okay, but like, why am I, but that adding that performance word to it makes sense to me. I'm at my place of work. I want to not have people view me as incapable of taking care of myself or not okay, or, a problem to be, because people do treat you differently because those situations can get very scary.
Of course.
Right. And so not always like the fault of the person then treating you different. It's scary to be in those situations, especially if they don't know. It's not like you're going to be like, hey, by the way, interviewer, I'm diabetic, No. Like maybe you would.
Because then there's possible fallout. But the point is that divulging your like medical status in the context of an interview is usually like frowned upon. You should shy away from that because of...
But why? Because people treat...
right?
Yeah. So it's kind of crazy. It's this like cyclical thing of not wanting to pretend, but also doing it because if you don't get the job. Or
because you're compelled to. You have to. And it's your performing...
Compelled performance.
Yes. You're performing normalcy.
Yeah.
When your body is in crisis mode,
Yeah.
right? And that, like, the necessity for people to perform normalcy in order to, in this context, in order to be able to get a job so that you can pay your bills and do something fulfilling related to what your like expertise or interests are. Having to perform normalcy for the purpose of that foundational like need, social need, is so messy and ableist, frankly. And it gets, it's just, and it comes back to this larger conversation about how we perform diabetes, not only on stage, which she talked about and was fascinating, but how we perform diabetes in and among society in general.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are a lot of ways that stigma and kind of social definitions of what and who is a diabetic that go into how diabetes is performed oftentimes. And it frames the way that we even can understand what it means to be a diabetic.
Yeah, and that was really interesting. I love that people are starting to perform these things, like perform going low and what it's like. And I think that's great because, one of my examples of this kind of performing, I was working for a retail shop here in town, and it was like a couple that owned this retail store. And so we were inputting information about items together, and they were both there and I was there, and I like felt I was going low, but it was one of those times where you're like, I'm fine. Like I've eaten something, I'm fine. And so I was just like going along. And there's this moment where you kind of realize that you're not okay, but you then aren't really like in a space to be like, I'm not okay. And so I could tell I was being weird, but at the same time, I thought I was like being fine and like
normal, right? Yeah.
My boss was like kind of looking at me weird, and he was like, "Are you like kind of like wondering?" They hadn't had an experience like this with me.
No.
And so he went over to his wife and was like, I don't think she's okay. And so they came over and finally were like, "Are you okay? Do you need to do your blood test?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I should." And they called Steve. And so it's like this interesting interaction where they hadn't had that experience, and now then they had it, and then better understand like that performative nature. And I think that's interesting to try and like portray that in a more accessible way for more people to see. Yeah. Right? Because I think the more we see these things, the better we understand them, and the better like they become normal to us. Right. So this person going low isn't this like, oh, let's all freak out and like cause more stress on this person who's already stressed about what's happening. Right.
Yeah.
And, I just think that's fascinating, all the stage performance and, trying to portray what that feels like, because a lot of times I kind of struggle in how to portray,
how to describe
what's happening and how I'm feeling and how the people are reacting to.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think a lot of this also gets to this large scale conversation about representation, right? And there's been a lot of conversation for, frankly, 2, 3, 4 decades, a lot of really productive conversation about representation in the, like media kind of portrayals, but in institutions as well around us, who can you see yourself and your experience in the world that is built around us, right? And so there's a lot of conversation about, part of why that's so important is because if you see yourself in the world that is built around us, then you are able to connect with that world, and there is a legitimate, like a feeling of this is a place for me. I am part of this place. Yeah. Right. And lack of representation does the exact opposite.
I was going to say, we were kind of talking about where you were when in your interview talking about sort of the way diabetics are represented in movies and culture and, TV shows. And comedies. She was talking about her work with Parks and Rec. And,
Yeah.
That's huge. The way that diabetes is represented large scale is generally the same,
Right.
It's you're fat or you're lazy or you're eating a lot of sugar and then we're making jokes about it or we're causing this tragic event in a hospital show about the diabetic. And even when they're trying to like point out like the insulin crisis or things that are happening, it's tragic. It's like, we're not, the protagonist is never the diabetic, right? Yeah. We're never talking about how the diabetic feels in this because they're always passed out in the hospital bed or non-present because we're talking about all the soda that they're drinking and giving themselves diabetes, And
so it becomes a tool for representing the important personal or social change of the subject.
Yeah,
or whoever the star is, right? That was a really important point. And also points toward how diabetes is also wrapped up in and coded with other social stigmas that bind up how and why diabetes and diabetics, importantly, are wrapped up in this whole thing. Because as we talked about a little bit there, diabetes is racialized.
Yeah.
Right? There are assumptions, a coding of blackness with diabetes, socially speaking. Equally true with poor/working class experiences and identities. And like you pointed out a minute ago, fatness, right? And size. And so these three like social identities, social locations, these three experiences, frankly, have been three major locations of large-scale social disdain.
Yeah.
Right? We're not talking about some kind of like lively or productive jest here. The jokes are rooted in, frankly, like hatred of that experience. But I think part of how and why that is rooted in some of what you and I were talking about as you were pointing out, how this revolves around fear.
Yeah, because you asked that question of why are these jokes being made this way? Why are like what is it about like the continuation of these jokes? And I said, I think it's fear. I think we were talking about the Will Smith, Chris Rock thing,
right?
Because you see him kind of laugh and then realize, oh crap, like
he sees what it
and it's
did
like
to Jada.
Then there's that fear. Yeah. Oh, well, now I need to like make up for that and do this, act.
Perform this like masculinity, etc.
Fear in that everybody eats, everybody indulges, right? And so in this society of you're going to get fat, you're going to get diabetes, you're going to, enter into this hated category experience. So fear that. And what like laughing at something that is feared, right? Like, oh, you're going to get diabetes. It's like, okay.
At
like,
is the operative word there, right?
Yeah.
You're laughing at diabetes.
Yes.
But importantly, as Bianca was talking about, it's not about laughing at diabetes. The joke is constructed about laughing at diabetics.
Yes.
Specifically.
And, it is really gross. It's really lazy comedy, honestly, because you're going to get easy laughs because that's what all of the comedy surrounding diabetes has always been portrayed, or at least for the past, how many years that you hear. It's constant. And every time I'm watching something, I'm always like, oh, Steve, here's another, she was talking about Colbert. Like, we love Colbert. And someone who, it just shows like anybody can fall privy to, using one of these jokes. And
for me, I think this comes back to a fairly large scale social kind of process that is personal in a lot of ways. And I feel like we talked about some of this in our interview with Heather Walker as well. But, the reality is, right, we tend to talk a lot about how we are in and part of society, right? And because society is bound up in and wrapped up in so many problematic framings of people, experiences, and the world, we are in that. And so it's a factor in how we understand ourselves and our world, right? But part of what we don't often talk about is how, because of that scenario, society is also in us, right? And so the willingness to constantly and consistently take that kind of critical eye toward ourselves, our assumptions about the world and each other, is necessary for us to be able to continue to better understand other people's experiences and not recreate those problems and not do the kind of work that is continuing to punch down,
Right.
to use her language there before, right? And do the work of punching up, right? Because otherwise, if we're not taking that self-critical eye consistently, we can't. We're going to miss it because it's part of us.
There's always things that we don't understand, right? There's lives and experiences that we don't understand.
Of course.
And, you know, everybody's going to make a joke that hurts somebody at some point. And it's like realizing, okay, like this, I missed this. I really missed what this did.
Missed the mark.
And I think, you know, looking at yourself in a critical way, right? Making sure that, you know, you can't escape ever making a mistake, right?
Right.
But it's less about that and more about, you know, trying to understand other people better, trying to understand other people's experiences better, especially marginalized groups.
Exactly.
You know, marginalized people who are constantly, you know, being punched down at.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, in many ways that is at the heart of the problem of diabetes and comedy, right? And I think in a lot of ways this connects back to some of what we were talking about a minute ago, briefly as well, but connects back to the importance of how comedy can actually be used to highlight the absurdity of actual life with diabetes in a way that is productive, in a way that is interesting.
Right.
Like Bianca was talking about how those jokes can be aimed toward how and why those government programs and systems are made to be impotent, socially impotent, right? They cannot do anything to make any change in society. And instead of critiquing through the comedy those structures that are the heart of the problem, instead they just make fun of fat people.
Yeah.
/ diabetics.
And you were kind of talking about like the self sort of like everything's relying upon self choice and your choice to become this way or make these choices to get you here, or, you know, and I think Bianca kind of mentioned like everybody's experiences and where your access to food is, medical care. There's so many differentiations in like people's experiences, you know, to funnel everybody into this one category of like, you made this choice and it got you here.
Right. And so all too often then, because of that hyper individualist kind of perspective or framing of this large scale social problem, instead of maintaining a focus on how and why society is set up in a way that makes it so that there are significant health disparities based around class, based around race, based around geography, based around age, and a number of other important factors here. Instead of that focus, necessarily, we then have a focus on, well, because such and such group of people are more, quote unquote, predisposed to diabetes, and usually they're referring to type 2 diabetes in particular, and the social coding of all this gets messy, but then they just, you get into that space of, instead of fixing the social problems, we move toward individual intervention that will not
Or just
ever.
criticizing, right?
and or criticizing. So outside of the medical establishment, then it would be in the context of the comedy, right? That is just criticism. There is nothing productive in that kind of space. But this focus on the individual will not ever change the social factors that predispose many to a variety of health concerns, right? Those are large-scale social structures.
Yeah.
At the heart of all of that, So, I felt like this conversation with Bianca was, I think, this important balance, though, right?
Yeah.
Between the critical eye to the way that all of this is being enacted to push diabetics down, and at the same time, the focus on how people are resisting.
Yeah.
Right? Through performance, in particular, in this case. But that balance there helps with the representation,
Right.
right? Because we are representing here, even on the podcast. And so how we are reproducing representation, and what it is exactly we're representing about those experiences, I think helps in framing the conversation about what this life is like.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for joining us here today, listening with Bianca and about cinnamon rolls. We hope everyone enjoyed the conversation. Let us know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and head over to Diabreadic.com. There are, besides the links to this episode and others, other past episodes, there also was a recent blog post there that unpacks a little bit of that kind of self-critical work we were referencing. And so worth kind of digging into a little bit more if you're interested. And go ahead and like and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to right now. And leave us a review. It will help us out, and it'll help us kind of aim the rest of the show toward the things that you all would like to hear about.